My name is Alex. I have had the privilege of being on staff at Aplos since the very beginning. I'm the first employee of Aplos, so I've been around for a long time. And if you've listened to any webinars or done any trainings or seen any product videos, you've probably seen me or heard me. So I apologize for yet another instance of hearing my voice. But I do these webinars, well, it's once a week or so, and end up doing kind of more the accounting oriented topics. So today, what we're going to be taking a look at is how to review and restructure your chart of accounts for the new year. Again, if you've been on a part of any of our webinars, you'll know that chart of accounts design is one of my favorite things to talk about. And that is said kind of tongue in cheek, but genuinely, it's actually a topic that I really enjoy talking about because I feel like it's something that is very intimidating, but doesn't have to be, and also is very empowering when you've got it kind of tuned in. So just kind of some housekeeping things. I will probably end up talking for 20, maybe 25 minutes or so, somewhere around 10:30 my time here. I'll probably stop talking. And then we'll have it open for some Q&A time. And this webinar is being recorded. So if you need to duck out or want to repeat this at some point, you're welcome to. I'm pretty sure everybody that's signed up gets the email of the recording. So yeah, you should see that sent to you. But all right, well, let's talk about restructuring your chart of accounts. I've got other webinars that we go over how to design a chart of accounts. What is your chart of accounts and what are your funds and what are tags? We're not going to be talking about that here today, but I do recommend maybe listening to that one, because in that webinar, I go over kind of the basics of what a chart of accounts is, and by chart of accounts, I mean, what are your accounts that you use in Aplos? What are the funds? What are the tags? What's kind of the categorical design of the system? Because for me, that is kind of the crux on which everything else is built. If you don't have a good chart of accounts, then when you enter your transactions, you're going to be coding and labeling and categorizing them using a not so great chart of accounts, which means you're going to get not so great reports. Nothing in this or any accounting system is magical. If you don't have good input, you will not have good output. So that's why I like the chart of accounts topic. So let's say that you've listened to that and or you've got some history in Aplos, and now you are on this webinar because you're thinking, well, should I or can I redesign things in order to more effectively manage and keep up with my finances for my organization in the coming years? And I would say, yes, there is the ability to do that. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go through how you would make those changes and when you might want to consider making some of those changes. And so if you have any questions as we go through this, just put them in there and I'll do my best to answer everything at the end. All right, well, it's February, and chances are you've maybe gotten the prior year buttoned up, and you've probably run some reports and been in here trying to make sure that everything is kind of shored up for the end of 2021. And kind of the most basic way to review your financial statements to see if you need changes is to simply run reports. Again, input and output, it's all based on the categorical design that you have in the system. So if you find yourself running reports and you see zeros, like meaning if you run an income statement and you run it for last year and you notice that there's a zero here, gain on sale of fixed asset, or you see that, employer taxes or whatever, fees, interest expense, if there are zeros here, then that is interesting, right? If you go to your balance sheet and you see that there are zeros, that is kind of a chief indicator of maybe you don't need this thing. And so that's an interesting thing to see, is zeros. You might also see that there are too many accounts. Maybe you will look through your chart of accounts and you see on your income statement that there are redundancies. Maybe you have multiple supplies accounts created, or you have things organized in groups that maybe don't make any sense. I would be looking for things like that. Or if you run a tag report and you think, man, it's really hard to get information for this tag. I'm not sure if I have this kind of created properly. Any walls that you bump up against in the system in terms of reporting might be a good question to bring up on whether or not your chart of accounts or your categorical design needs to be rethought. Sometimes it's a system thing. Sometimes we just don't have the report that you're looking for, and that's fine. But a lot of the times it is based on how you designed your chart of accounts. So my advice here is your chart of accounts will change over time no matter what. So let's say that you were the first person to design it, and then now 2 years has passed. chances are you do things a little bit differently now than you did 2 years ago. Maybe not drastically, but especially when it comes to income and expense accounts, those things change over time just naturally. You end up doing more programs, you end up doing less programs, you hire or reconsolidate staff members, you maybe breach into other services, you might grow, you might contract. Just time brings change, right? So it's not uncommon to need to take a good look at your chart of accounts and to review that every so often to see, do we need to make any sort of change? You may have also inherited this chart of accounts design from years past. I can't tell you how many organizations I've dealt with that have a chart of accounts that was built somewhere back in the early 2000s or even farther back, and it's just been the same, and it's changed hands, in terms of the bookkeeper or the management staff. It's changed hands multiple times, and so now you have this chart of accounts that you have no buy-in into, and you're not really sure why these categories exist, how it was determined in the first place. It's just kind of this remnant, Frankenstein chart of accounts design. That might be the case. I've seen that a lot. A lot of the times people kind of reboot that when they come into Aplos. So you may not have that in Aplos, I guess is what I'm trying to say, but you might be familiar with that setup. And or sometimes it's just time for a change. Maybe you have a chart of accounts that's working, but you can see in the future that you're going to need to accommodate for different things, or maybe grow, or just kind of maybe we just kind of overall just redo how you're thinking about things, and that's completely fine as well. So however you get to the determination, how then can you change these things? Okay, sorry about that. I have no idea why that happened. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. All right. Well, to make these changes, fortunately, Aplos is a pretty open system. So if you go to your account list here or your tags, then you can essentially make edits anytime you want. So if you were to click into an account, you can change the number, you can change the name, you can even drag this little, I call it the pancake icon, or the hamburger, the little 3-line thing here. You can drag that, and you can drag it to a new group. You can even create a new group down here at the bottom of the section. You can drag accounts into being sub-accounts of one another or drag them around. You can basically make any changes you want at any time. The only couple of things to keep in mind is what you are changing, and is that necessarily something that you want to do? So for instance, if I were to change the number and the name of this particular account, this is changing the number and the name of this account. That sounds basic, but what I mean is that if I were to change this into being something completely different, and maybe let's go to expenses. If I were to change utilities here to rent, and I already have a rent, I'm just saying as example, if I were to change this category that used to be and used for utilities to something completely different, then this is going to change all of the history in my system to be the new thing. Which means if I were to go run a report for last year and go look for the line item of utilities, it no longer is going to read utilities, it's going to read rent. And so changing accounts that already exist may or may not be what you need to do. You can certainly do that. If you have a category that you've just never used, or you don't really care if it gets reconsolidated into something different, then by all means, go ahead and change it. But if you need to essentially kind of sunset the use that it has been in the past and create some new categories, here's what I would recommend. So normally folks run with a 4-digit structure in terms of the account number, but you might want to reuse some of these numbers. So let's say that I wanted to repurpose this utilities thing here and call it something different. Let's see. Let's pick on something different. Let's pick on utilities again, but I'm just now going to change this to program supplies or something. So instead of changing this into program supplies, which again is not utilities, so I don't want to confuse any historical reporting, what I might want to do is disable this, which will prevent it from being used going forward. And then what I like to do is I like to add a couple of zeros at the end of this account number, which means I can reuse 5110 because now it's 511,000. So by changing the number here, I basically will be able to recycle the number, and then I've disabled it. So going forward, that thing has now been increased in digit value and is now disabled. So if I were to go enter a transaction, utilities will not be an option. But if I went and ran a report for a period of time that used this account, it would then show up on the report. So it's still there, but just can't be used going forward. But now I can come in here and use 5110 and call it program supplies. And there's no issue with using that same number. Okay, so again, if you need to kind of reboot the numbers, then you can do that. The other thing that you can do is you can create new groups and you can call it, disabled accounts, and you can move everything over there. Just keep in mind, again, that as you change and remove and restructure the grouping and the organization of things, it does change that on all of your historical reports. So if you were to go back and run a profit and loss or an income statement for a year before, and you want to stack that up against a different report, and you're used to seeing it kind of organized a certain way, if you are changing all of that organization, then it's going to reflect. The other thing you could do is if you've not used an account ever, then what you can do is come in here and just simply delete it. Oop, see, and it'll tell you if I've used this, I've used it in one transaction there, so I can't delete it. Let's see if I've deleted copy or lease. Okay, I've never used copy or lease, so I'm going to delete it. And so what I would recommend is going through all of your account sections and seeing, do these things actually need to be here? In terms of your assets, these are accounts, again, that are created to represent money that you actually own somewhere. So whether it's a bank account or a fixed asset or receivable, usually there are some inherited things here as well. So if you have some of these accounts here that just don't make any sense, so it's like, we don't have equipment, I'm not sure why it's there, then delete it. There's no point for it being on your chart of accounts if you don't actually functionally use the thing. It's not doing anything, just sitting there. So you can delete it, you can renumber it, you can repurpose it, whatever you'd like to do. Same with your liabilities. If you have debt accounts here that just do not apply for you in your organization, then you can simply delete them or repurpose them. If you don't have a building, then you probably don't have a building mortgage. So if you don't have that, then delete it. Same with your income and expenses. Now, income and expenses, again, are a little bit more fluid. Probably if not year, every 2 years, it's probably good to take a look through your income and expense categories to see if there's any changes that might need to be, restructured there. And again, it's more up to whoever you need to report to, because you might have needed a certain reporting requirement in years past, and now that's changed. Either the management has changed, or just kind of the structure of your organization has changed. So it's worth rebooting and kind of seeing if there's a way to change all that stuff. Again, perfectly fine. Something to keep in mind if you're doing some of these more pervasive changes, though, is, again, you can make all these changes in here, but if you're going to be doing something that is very structural in its change, meaning, like, let's say that you've been using something as tags, but it actually should be funds. And so that is like an inherently different use of a category. Or you have a tremendous amount of chart of accounts and you are looking to kind of mass disable or reuse things and kind of use tags or funds in place of that. If the upheaval feels like it's really kind of ripping the carpet out rather than just doing some tweaks, then you could also contact our support team, and it might be worth looking at having a new account. And there's typically not a cost associated with this. We don't do it super often, but every once in a while, it's just too much work than it's worth to try to change things in the system. It's better to kind of just reboot and start a whole new account, start fresh, bring over some starting balances, and we can always give you access to the old account if you need to access it for historical reporting. But as of a certain date, you kind of just start fresh in a new account in Applos. So that is one option there as well. Let's see, tags work pretty similarly to accounts. You can always turn these on or off. You can disable them or renumber or rename them, remove, or you can move them around. You can create new groups. So again, tags are pretty changeable. Same with accounts. The one category that does become a little bit more difficult to disable or repurpose are your funds. So at the moment, there's not a way to disable a fund, but I will walk you through kind of my workaround for doing that here in just a second. The reason for that is we just, for the most part, have not just built the feature. I do think that we will do that at some point, but at the moment, there's just not a way to disable these things. You can just change the name, and then in the equity account down here, you can, again, just kind of change the name. But if you want to remove or disable or kind of recycle one of these funds, I would recommend doing a couple of things. The first of which is to run a report, specifically a balance sheet, filtered by that particular fund. Let's just take my grant fund here. And you want to make sure that this is 0 across the board. What you don't want to do is disable or stop using a fund that continues to carry a balance, because this will continue to impact your financials. So if I have, 65,000 here, this is just a demo account, but if I have a cash balance sitting here and a liability, and I'm saying this no longer applies for this particular fund, then what I need to do is somehow do a fund transfer to move these balances out, and or just I need to somehow get rid of them so that way this fund is essentially empty. And so once it's empty, I can then take some action on the chart of accounts. So first thing is to make sure that it is empty going forward as of whatever cutoff date you want. And then in your chart of accounts, you would do a couple of things here. First of which is you need to make sure that the fund listing up at the top is consistent with your equity listing down here at the bottom. And your funds, depending on what screen you're on, will either list themselves alphabetically or numerically based on the equity number. So I would recommend changing both. So let's say that my grant fund here is the one that I want to disable or archive. So what I would do is I would come into the fund name here and I would say ZZ archive or disabled or something, and then just change the name to be something like that. So that way, if it's ever on a list, it shoots itself down at the very bottom because there's 2 Z's. So alphabetically, it's just automatically going to sort at the very bottom. And then I've changed the name to be something very clear, archive. You could say do not use or disabled or something like that. Again, just something to where if somebody's just reading a name, then it would be very clear, I should probably not be using this fund. And when I change the fund name up here, it does change the fund name down here in the equity section, but the equity account name is the same. So what I would need to do is come in here, and I'm actually going to change the name as well to ZZ Archive Grant Fund Balance. And then I'm going to do the same thing numerically to reuse or repurpose the number. I'm going to add 2 zeros. So what this does is if the name is being used to show the funds, it shoots it to the very bottom. It's very clear. You've got ZZ Archive, whatever fund. And same thing down here, the equity account is the same as well. And then I've also renumbered it so that way if the list is ever numerical, it shoots it down to the very bottom. So not only can I reuse 3,300 now, but now this is at the very, very bottom of any numerically sorted list. So again, if anybody's going to use this fund, it's going to be very clear. It's at the bottom of any list, it's numbered weird, and it's got the name of ZZ Archive or disabled or something like that. So if you do something like this, it's very clear as of a certain date that this should not be used anymore. And if it's all zeroed out into your reports, then essentially you won't have any balance going forward. And yeah, that's kind of my best recommendation to disabling a fund at the moment until we actually have the ability to click in here and say, disabled, much like we do the other accounts. Okay. Let's see. I think that's about it that I wanted to cover. Again, changing chart of accounts in Applos is actually very simple. The hard part comes with determining if a change needs to be made, which again comes through kind of your normal day-to-day transaction entry, as well as your reporting. So if you end up bumping into any walls in your reports, if your reports are difficult, hard to read, hard to understand, difficult to get to, it's possible that there's some sort of system limitation there and that our support team can help, test that to see if there's maybe a different report or something that you could use. But most times that I've found, it actually boils down to your chart of accounts. So if you've determined, okay, something is not working on our reports, we need to reboot our chart of accounts to a certain degree. It might be pervasive, it might be slight changes, but either way, once you've identified what needs to change, or why rather, then you can go in there and actually make the structural changes. So you can renumber, you can rename, you can reorganize, or you can disable accounts at any time. You can also do the same thing with tags. You can also, you can't disable a fund, but you can kind of renumber and rename it as well. So for the most part, you can kind of work within the existing account to make any of these changes that you need. And then if you ever need to do something very structural, meaning, again, you're not just doing minor tweaks, you're not necessarily just painting the walls, but you're actually ripping out the carpet and doing some construction and wanting to completely restructure your categorical design, then what we could do is explore creating a new account for you, because every once in a while, those changes, making them in the system just don't make sense. So what we could do is set up a new account, get the chart of accounts loaded in there. You can kind of change things, and that way there's no transactions or anything to worry about. You can kind of just start fresh with a new chart of accounts, and that way as of a certain date you can cut over and start using the new account, and we can always grant you access to the old account, so that way you can go back and access those historical records if you need to. I've also had some folks that want to migrate data from one account to the other. That is an option as well. However, it's a little bit more involved. So that's one where we would have to talk more about that and see what the scope of that project is, and whether or not that's something that we could help with, or just something we would need to coach you on how to do. All right, and that's about all I have in terms of restructuring your chart of accounts. Pretty quick topic here today. All righty. Well, thanks everyone for showing up today. I hope the information was helpful. And if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. Our support is free. Thank you for using Aplos, and have a good rest of your week. Talk to you soon.